Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. It has been 1 year since the withdrawal of NATO troops from Afghanistan, and the country itself is in dire straits. There is more to be said than we need to ensure the rights of women and girls, that they can actually get the educational needs and equality within the borders of Afghanistan. There's more to it than just that, in that the people of Afghanistan are in need of humanitarian aid, and there are many who are going hungry within their borders, and there is a need for assistance in economic and industrial development. The history of Afghanistan goes back further than the 20 years of the NATO occupation of Afghanistan. It also should include some of the dire straits of the occupation of the Soviet Union that happened before the NATO taking over Afghanistan. That this country has been in dire straits for nearly 3 decades. That the conditions of the country have improved marginally, in the fact that maybe there is no longer a active war taking place, but there's still a lot of economic development, and the country itself has been in straits for over 30 years. And the withdrawal of, or the withholding of assets, and making demands of that we need to see Western style democracy, may be at the detriment of the people. Also, we also need to consider that while that's being said by the current Taliban government, that could be actually clouded and colored in order to get the world to be in solidarity with the Taliban itself. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot that needs to happen. Aid needs to get through to the right people. The providing of medications, as India, you'll hear India providing lots of aid to the Afghan people, and their attempts to get through to the people actually in need. We'll hear about that. We'll hear about the argument from the Russian and China side of things versus the NATO side of the argument, what is going on and what needs to happen in Afghanistan. Ultimately, while we're sitting here debating politics over what needs to happen, there are people who are in desperate need, and it doesn't matter their gender, it doesn't matter their religious background. they need the help, and they need it to happen as soon as possible. So let's listen to what actually happened in the UN Security Council's floor as they spoke about what was happening in Afghanistan.
The 9,118th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in Afghanistan. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Afghanistan, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Pakistan to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Mr. Marcus Pozzo, Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General for Afghanistan. And Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards, Independent Researcher and Author. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Thanks very much indeed, Mr. President. The people in Afghanistan continue to face extreme hardship and uncertainty. And let me share some numbers with you. Close to 19 million people are facing acute levels of food insecurity, including 6 million people at risk of famine. More than half of the population, some 24 million people, need humanitarian assistance, and an estimated 3 million children are acutely malnourished. They include over 1 million children estimated to be suffering from the most severe, life-threatening form of malnutrition. Without specialized treatment, these children could die. This malnutrition crisis is fueled by recurrent drought, including the worst in 3 decades in 2021, and whose effects are still lingering. 8 out of 10 Afghans drink contaminated water, making them susceptible to repeated bouts of acute watery diarrhea. Around 25 million people are now living in poverty, and 3/4 of people's income is spent on food. There's been a 50% decline in households receiving remittances. Unemployment could reach 40%, and inflation is rising due to increased global prices, import constraints, and currency depreciation. So these relentless layers of crisis persist at a time when communities are already struggling. In June, a 5.9 magnitude earthquake affected over 360,000 people living in high-intensity areas, impact areas. And since July, heavy rains have led to massive flash floods across the country and indeed the region, killing and injuring hundreds of people, destroying thousands of homes, as well as thousands of acres of crops. Afghanistan has also witnessed unprecedented levels of internal displacement and population movement. Some 5.8 million people remain in protracted internal displacement, requiring long-term solutions. So these are the figures, Mr. President, and they're devastating, and frankly, they're difficult to comprehend. We worry that they will soon become worse. Once the cold weather sets in, food and fuel prices, already high, will skyrocket, and families will have to choose between feeding their children, sending them to school, taking them to a doctor when they fall sick, or keeping them warm. Mr. President, Afghanistan's problems are unfortunately neither new nor unique. Conflict, poverty, climate shocks, food insecurity have long been a sad reality for Afghanistan and for many other countries around the world. But let me outline what makes Afghanistan's current situation so critical. Large-scale development assistance has been halted for a year. Before the Taliban's takeover, Afghanistan was already facing severe levels of food insecurity and malnutrition, and these levels have, of course, deteriorated since development aid was halted, affecting families everywhere, from rural communities to urban centers. The operating environment, second point, is extremely challenging. Engaging with the de facto authorities at national and subnational levels is labor-intensive. There's no confidence in the domestic banking sector, heading to a severe liquidity crisis. International financial transactions are extremely hard due to de-risking and over-compliance of global banks. Humanitarians have brought in over $1 billion in cash to sustain program delivery, but the liquidity and banking crisis continues to impact delivery of assistance and on the daily lives of Afghans. The Humanitarian Exchange Facility that we have discussed before, intended to temporarily and partially alleviate this liquidity issue, is still under negotiation and review by the de facto authorities. Women and girls have been pushed to the sidelines, as we have observed also in this chamber. The meager gains the country made to protect women's rights have been quickly reversed. It's been more than a year since adolescent girls in Afghanistan last set foot inside a classroom. In the 21st century, we should not need to explain why girls' education and women's empowerment are important to them, to their communities, to their countries, and indeed to all of us. Mr. President, Afghanistan is a humanitarian crisis, but it's not only that. It's an economic crisis. It's a climate crisis. It's a hunger crisis. It's a financial crisis, but it is not a hopeless crisis. Humanitarian organizations have done their utmost to provide the population in Afghanistan with a lifeline. Despite the many challenges that we have just been reviewing, UN agencies and NGO partners have mounted an unprecedented response over the past year, reaching almost 23 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. We all expanded humanitarian operations to reach affected communities in all the 401 districts of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. This was possible because of a reduction in conflict, the introduction of cash shipments, the $1 billion that I have referred to, Mr. President, and the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2615. But of course, humanitarian aid will never be able to replace the provision of system-wide services to 40 million people across the country and the need to support those services on a sustainable basis. Mr. President, preserving basic service delivery alongside humanitarian assistance remains the only way to prevent a catastrophe even greater than we've seen these many months. Poverty is deepening, the population is still growing, and the de facto authorities have no budget to invest in their own future. It's clear to us, I'm sure it's clear to all of us, that some development support needs to be restarted. Humanitarian programming must and will continue, but the UN country team in Afghanistan, under the exceptional leadership of Ramiz Alakbarov, the resident and humanitarian coordinator, is developing its strategic framework for next year, for 2023, to address these broader basic human needs. More than 70% of Afghans live in rural areas. If agriculture and livestock production are to be protected If they're not, millions of lives will be risked, and the country's capacity to produce food for its population imperiled. Hospitals and clinics at district and national levels must be kept running, their staff employed and paid. Nutrition centres, preventive care must be maintained. These are all the basic services to which we refer. Outreach to financial institutions to mitigate against bank de-risking must be stepped up. And we must continue to work to ensure that girls and women are educated and employed and free to do so. The consequences of inaction in both the humanitarian and the development fronts will be catastrophic and difficult to reverse. Currently, the humanitarian response plan for Afghanistan has a gap of $3.14 billion, with over $600 million urgently required to support priority winter preparation, such as upgrades and repairs to shelter, warm clothes, blankets, and so forth. We're up against time. These particular contributions are needed within the next 3 months. In addition, $154 million is needed to pre-position supplies, including food and livelihood assistance, before the winter weather cuts off access to certain areas. The humanitarian community has indeed stayed and delivered for the people of Afghanistan and continues to do so. It's imperative that the international community, as reflected here, continues to do the same. Afghanistan's de facto authorities must do their part. Bureaucratic interferences and procedures slow down humanitarian assistance when it is needed most. Female humanitarian aid workers, both national and international, must be allowed to work unhindered and securely, and girls must be allowed to continue their education. There are many musts, Mr. President, but there are many opportunities. The path is clear and the dangers equally so. The people of Afghanistan are still there. They have shown incredible resilience over the decades and in this last year. Our task is to help them to prosper, to flourish, and to be safe. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Griffith for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Marcus Potzel.
Thank you, Mr. President. The focus of the request for this briefing has been on the humanitarian and economic situation. And I fully endorse the comments that have been made by my colleague, Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under-Secretary General for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Since the takeover by the Taliban 1 year ago, the United Nations has remained exceptionally focused on addressing humanitarian and human needs in Afghanistan. And as Mr. Griffiths has stated, needs in Afghanistan continue to be significant. I'm scheduled to brief this same council in only a few weeks on the overall situation in Afghanistan. In addition, the Security Council will soon receive a report from the Secretary General on the situation in Afghanistan. But given this opportunity, I would like to provide a few thoughts on the current situation. First, the current regime in Afghanistan has not been recognized by any member of the international community. The reasons for that are clear. The international community has norms regarding human rights, especially those of women and girls, representative governance, and international collective security. Afghanistan is part of this international system, and the Taliban need to adhere to their international obligations, but instead request recognition based on the fact that they have secured territorial control. Second, there's no question that the sanctions against the Taliban have affected the Afghan economy since the Taliban have taken control. This has been documented in previous reports of the Secretary General, and the Secretary General has also called for measures to allow the Afghan economy to breathe. These include efforts to facilitate access to assets belonging to the Afghan Central Bank for the benefit of the Afghan people, in addition to international assistance that supports basic human needs. In other words, interventions that go beyond merely providing humanitarian assistance, but support the resilience of Afghan communities. Humanitarian aid is not a long-term solution. Poverty reduction, as well as the delivery of basic goods and services, must ultimately rely on sustained economic growth. Donors have repeatedly stated that the resumption of economic cooperation hinges primarily on Taliban action to reverse regressive policies. Third, the Taliban de facto authorities are faced with a growing number of governance challenges. Discarding persistent rumors of international differences, the Taliban continue to present themselves as a unified, cohesive governing entity. The Kabul-based cabinet meets regularly, with outcomes of meetings reported publicly by the de facto authorities. However, the relationship between the cabinet in Kabul and the Kandahar-based Taliban leader Haibatullah Akhundzada remains unclear. Practices to govern by decree and through policy decisions declared to be in adherence with Islam and Afghan traditions have further curtailed fundamental human rights and freedoms, especially for women and girls, such as the 23rd March announcement of the continued closure of secondary education for girls. Today, Afghanistan is the only country in the world that denies girls the full right to education. Mr. President, the last 3 weeks have seen the highest number of civilian casualties in a 1-month period since August 15, 2021, in a series of improvised explosive device attacks in Kabul, most claimed by ISIL-K. Such attacks often target specific ethnic and religious groups. We are encouraged to hear that the de facto authorities are looking into what can be done to ensure greater security for these communities. In July, UNAMA released its report, Human Rights in Afghanistan, covering the 10-month period since the Taliban takeover till 15th June this year. It reflects the human rights priorities set out in UNAMA's mandate given by this Council. UNAMA documented human rights violations targeting specific groups such as former government officials and members of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, individuals accused of affiliation with ISIL-K and the National Resistance Front, civil society, media, and women, including those accused of so-called moral crimes. UNAMA is particularly concerned about reports on action taken by the de facto officials from the promotion of virtue and prevention of vice departments that result in verbal harassment, ill treatment, arbitrary arrests of people as they carry out their daily lives. Attacks against human rights defenders, journalists and media workers, combined with the impact of broader policy measures taken by the de facto authorities, have had a chilling effect on freedom of the media and civic activism. Last week's inaugural meeting of the Media Violation Commission is a welcome development if it indeed works to prevent further restrictions of free media space. Lastly, I would like to commend the regional response to the current situation. Afghanistan's neighbors are the most immediately affected and sometimes feel threatened by what happens in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's neighbors responded by convening meetings at foreign ministers level, first in Islamabad, then in Tehran, followed by Beijing. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation also mobilized, holding a special meeting at the foreign ministers level in Islamabad last year. Last month, an international conference on Afghanistan took place in Tashkent with the participation of a high-level Taliban delegation. Discussions focused on the importance of counterterrorism and counter-narcotic efforts, economic and infrastructure development, inclusive governance, and respect for human and civic rights, especially the rights of women, including girls' education. It is important for the Taliban to understand that neighbors, regional partners, and the wider Islamic world want them to be part of the international community. Afghanistan is a landlocked country that depends on its neighbors for access to trade routes, but is also a country with tremendous potential resources that, if properly harnessed, could benefit Afghanistan and its region as well as the wider world. Mr. President, as I have mentioned, I will have more to tell to this Council a few weeks from now on the specific situation in the country. Afghanistan itself, I believe, has not recovered from serious geopolitical shocks and interventions by foreign powers. None of these interventions have achieved their designs. All of them have altered Afghanistan in ways that were unexpected and often unhelpful. Despite immense resources expended over the past decades, Afghanistan remains significantly underdeveloped, vulnerable, and in need of international assistance. United Nations officials and UNAMA, including through its 11 field offices across the country, continue to engage with the de facto authorities and facilitate engagements between the de facto authorities, community leaders, religious groups, women and civil society, aimed to promote inclusive and participatory governance and the promotion of rights and freedoms. The Taliban have been ambiguous as to the extent to which they would wish to engage, predicated on being in accordance with their interpretation of Sharia law. It is vital to move beyond an exchange of hardened positions towards a sustained dialogue between the Taliban, other Afghan stakeholders, the wider region, and the international community. Such dialogue must place the interests of all Afghans at its center. The future stability of Afghanistan rests on meeting the needs of the Afghan people, preserving their rights, and reflecting the country's diversity in all governance structures. Let us all look ahead and improve the situation together rather than dwell on the past. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Postle for his briefing. I now give the floor to Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. President. A year on from the US chaotic and uncoordinated withdrawal of Kabul, Afghanistan verges on complete economic collapse, severe food insecurity, the rise of extremism, and fragmentation of the social order are evident. An informed insider who recently left Kabul told me last week the situation is returning to that of 1992 to 1993, when interfactional fighting turned Kabul into a battle zone with civilians caught in the midst. This rapid disintegration of Afghanistan following the departure of the international community last year is no surprise. To those paying attention, the signs of how this would all end were already visible in 2001. Incredibly, the same Western media sirens led by the BBC, which in September 2001 cheered on the military invasion of Afghanistan, telling a gullible Western public this would lead to a liberal-style democracy, by August 2021 feigned surprise that the Taliban had taken Kabul so quickly. But Taliban political influence in rural areas grew exponentially from 2003 in proportion to the broken promises, corruption, brutal militarized response, and extrajudicial killing overseen by the West. That the Taliban initially regained influence in rural areas by providing shadow governors to assist with dispute resolution and other services is testament to the carelessness of the West in Afghan matters. To know why this catastrophic failure occurred, it is necessary to understand what the main characteristics of the post-2001 Western intervention of Afghanistan encompassed. I list these as follows. Number one, impunity. The return and support of unindicted warlords by Western intelligence in October 2001 proved fatal to the state-building project. It led to knock-on effects on security, human rights, and the rule of law. Newly empowered financially, I witnessed the political rehabilitation of these Western allies at the 2002 emergency lawyer Jirga, where I was an observer. As CNN and the BBC trumpeted the lawyer Jirga as a rebirth of Afghan democracy and obsessed over images of Afghan women putting ballots into boxes, behind the scenes, the emergency lawyer Jirga was overseen by the CIA and UNAMA, with the US ambassador Khalilzad publicly humiliating and barricading participation by the beloved former king, and enabling participation of warlords and the intimidation of democratically elected candidates by armed groups and Northern Alliance internal security. The corrosive issue of impunity and its effect on rule of law and thus legitimacy, and thereby the ability to build a state, is something I focus on in my PhD. The West failed to engage with such concepts, preferring to impose its own version of the so-called liberal democracy on Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the result was a corrupt, networked state. On a supranational level, the International Criminal Court has also failed to indict any parties in relation to grave human rights abuses in Afghanistan, whether state or non-state actors. Number 2, failure to support human rights. Despite promises about a new era of human rights and women's rights, the West failed to adequately fund or support the newly created Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, nor to support work on transitional justice or even truth and reconciliation, South African style. One example was the site of the Dashti Laili killings of Taliban captured by Commander Dostum in late 2001, where mass burial sites were left unprotected and the crimes unindicted because they had been committed by a Western ally. This climate of impunity further emboldened warlords to return to their fiefdoms to engage in illicit activities such as expropriation of property and children, or drug trafficking, intimidation, and murder. By 2005, when I visited NATO countries' provincial reconstruction teams, I found NATO commanders thought it appropriate to use local warlords to guard the perimeter fences of their bases. Meanwhile, local Afghans complained to me of the abuses committed by these same NATO allies and felt their concerns of no consequence to the West. People thus turned to the Taliban. Number 3, military operations characterized by killing of civilians, failed intelligence, and war crimes. This included, for example, accusations that British special forces had committed extrajudicial killing of detainees in 2011, or Operation Enduring Freedom and NATO bombings of civilian gatherings, including weddings. The USA's £22,000 mother-of-all bombs dropped on civilians in the Shinwar region of eastern Afghanistan in 2017 exemplified the inhumanity of the entire operation. Number 4, failure to understand legitimate local leadership and work with the tribal system in rural areas. And I'll just add here that at the Bonn Agreement, from the beginning, there was exclusion of many important Pashtun tribal leaders who should have been invited to the beginning of the state-building project. I'd also add that the peace plan, already prepared by Commander Abdul Haq, and which had buy-in from all sides by 9/11, was well known in Washington, D.C. and London before the events of 9/11. Abdul Haq, who was known as a brilliant commander during the 1980s war against the USSR, warned that a bombing campaign by the West after 9/11 would change the political landscape overnight, disrupting the elaborate framework of cells he had built up within the Taliban to topple the regime internally. I document this extensively in my book. Abdul Haq had also warned of the extremism being fostered in training camps and madrasas back to the early the money-making nexus for the military-industrial complex, to extort from the US and European taxpayer, as we were warned by former President Eisenhower, General Smedley Butler, and more recently Julian Assange, has been catastrophic in Afghanistan. The human and financial costs of the war have been extensively documented by scholars at the Watson Institute, Brown University. They estimate a financial spend of some $8 trillion on the post-9/11 wars through fiscal year 2022, or some $300 million per day paid from the US taxpayer to fund the war in Afghanistan. The human costs have included indiscriminate bombing of innocent civilians. These are also documented by the Watson Institute, and of course women and children who we were supposed to be going into Afghanistan to assist have borne the brunt of these illegitimate bombing campaigns. The US spent around $148 billion on supposedly reconstructing Afghanistan. Yet the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, has reported many instances whereby money was spent on useless white elephant projects which were simply unable to be used. These failures lead to suspicion the projects were more about recycling US taxpayer money back to military supply contractors or arms companies with links to the US political class, from Unocal to Lockheed Martin to Raytheon to Halliburton, among others. There was also failure to involve Afghans in the design and implementation of projects generally, which has of course been disastrous for longer-term viability. Huge amounts were spent on training the Afghan National Army and police force, and much focus on supplying them with US military equipment, much of which, as we know, was left behind in Afghanistan a year ago. Yet often salaries were embezzled by government officials and soldiers were poorly trained and unable to function without US air power. Again, SIGAR has documented the waste and failure of these schemes. Number 6, failure to support Afghan agriculture, which was always the heart of the economy, with 80% of the population previously directly or indirectly involved. With land, water, labor, and experience, the focus on agriculture would have been the easiest way to develop the economy, enable people to participate, and become self-reliant and food secure. One of my interlocutors says that today, Afghanistan is 50 years behind what it used to be in agriculture. It is importing citrus fruit from Pakistan when citrus was previously exported from Nangarhar, for example. With over 90% of Afghans today not having sufficient food, it is obvious that agriculture should have been a major focus. Indeed, I was shocked when working for the World Food Programme in spring 2002 to see that the FAO had just a handful of international staff present, something like 2, compared to hundreds that the WFP was employing at the time. The focus by WFP on bringing US wheat into Afghanistan has thus also enabled farmers to grow more opium, since their markets for wheat have been very distorted. The above factors indicate extreme deception about what was really at the heart of the 20-year Western occupation of Afghanistan and what prompted the sudden withdrawal. Far from building a stable state that could never again be host to terrorism, it appears the entire project was more about recycling US and NATO taxpayer monies into the coffers of private business interests. When I published my book in 2011, I naively asked an American former intelligence officer based in Geneva how the US could have managed to have failed so miserably in Afghanistan. His response was, just follow the money. For some people, this whole project has been a staggering success. He exhorted me to look at the work on the military-industrial complex by Frida Berrigan. 10 years later, with the August 2021 withdrawal, and Afghanistan left as a hulking shell with economic collapse, the rise of ISIL, and renewed insecurity, his words ring very true today.
Voila.
I thank Dr. Morgan Edwards for her briefing. I now give the floor to the members of the Security Council. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we thank the head of OCHA, Martin Griffiths, for his assessments of the situation in Afghanistan. We listened closely to the deputy head of UNAMA, Marcus Potzel, and Dr. Lucy Morgan-Edwards, who worked for many years in the country in various areas and who witnessed the years of the USA and NATO intervention. Tomorrow marks exactly a year since the withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan. On the 30th of August 2021, the entire world saw photographs of the American Boeing leaving Kabul, with ordinary Afghans clinging to its chassis in panic. We all recall very well that this was preceded by large-scale domestic political changes, marking the beginning of a new phase. After 20 years of bloody war, the former president of the country, Ashraf Ghani, shamefully fled Kabul, and he was followed by many other Afghan political figures. The return to power of the Taliban movement in the country was entirely unexpected for everyone, including those who until recently had loudly been talking about the high level of fighting capacity of the Afghan security forces who had been trained over those years. Today's meeting may be a good opportunity to discuss the results and consequences of this ignominious 20-year campaign in Afghanistan, which cost more than 1,000 lives of ordinary Afghans and American soldiers and maimed hundreds of thousands, as well as costing $2 trillion, which could have been used for noble purposes. Incidentally, we harbour no particular illusions over this. In the last 12 months, we have all witnessed how Washington has hypocritically tried to blame the failure of its 20-year war and the current deteriorating situation on the new authorities. At the same time, as we understand, trying to cast the USA in a positive light, President Joe Biden declared that all of those objectives in the country were achieved. I recall that the Americans entered Afghanistan with a particular mission, the fight against terrorism. In actual fact, their arrival in the country only strengthened its status as a hotbed of terrorism and a center for the production and distribution of narcotics. Alongside the presence of al-Qaeda and related groups in de facto US and Western ally-controlled Afghanistan, ISIL also emerged and strengthened its influence. We've been speaking about this since 2017, but our Western partners only very recently acknowledged it. And yet, the potential of ISIL fighters this entire time has steadily been growing, including thanks to financial support from abroad and a flow of foreign terrorist fighters that have acquired fighting experience in other crisis spots around the world. The rise in drug production over these years has also reached unheard-of dimensions. Before our eyes, the country has literally become a breeding ground for terrorism and narcotics, and the effective fight against those threats, as our Western allies claimed, is the reason why the United States and NATO preserved their presence there for many years. All of our calls to highlight the growing threat from ISIL in Afghanistan came up against the clear desire by Western colleagues to downplay the scale of it or to sweep it under the carpet altogether. At the same time, the United States had many opportunities, including material, military and technical opportunities, and also time to eliminate terrorists in Afghanistan. The foreign military contingents that were in the country, however, hypocritically continued to make out as though the drug problem didn't exist at all, even though the flow of Afghan heroin at that moment had already reached many Western European countries. Over these years, there has been no answer to the repeated questions in the Council chamber about unidentified helicopters that transported ISIL fighters and their weapons to various parts of the country, including to the north, in the conditions of the full control by coalition forces over the situation, as we were assured. Quite the opposite, however. All these years, we've been hearing constantly about the Western colleagues' efforts to strengthen the fighting capacity of the Afghan National Security Forces, their effective training and control over the security situation. Against this backdrop, the socio-economic situation in the country has remained dire. Incidentally, during the Soviet period, more than 140 enterprises were set up in the country, including industrial ones. They became the backbone of the economy, and established a firm foundation for the independent, sustainable development of the country. What's more, schools were built, there were student exchanges, and requalification courses were conducted. How many enterprises, how many companies were set up during the 20 years of the NATO presence in the country? I'll give you the answer. Not a single one. Quite the opposite. Billions in investments have lined the pockets of corrupt American puppets. Ultimately, the country has become dependent on outside assistance without any prospects for independent development. Particular attention should be paid to the situation of the protection of the civilian population. To our Western colleagues who prefer recently in any discussion on Afghanistan to boil the discussion down to the subject of human rights violations, we would like to remind you of the irresponsible actions of American and NATO forces that regularly launched indiscriminate airstrikes against ordinary Afghans. And that's without mentioning the nighttime raids and extrajudicial killings of civilians, including women and children. Unfortunately, despite the reports of various independent non-governmental organizations about these monstrous war crimes, to try to get justice and to hold those guilty to account, investigations have not been conducted due to the gross blackmail exerted by Washington. Any efforts to this end by the ICC were roundly squashed by the USA under the threat of sanctions. And incidentally, no one was surprised by this level of cynicism because the American colleagues acted in the same way when it came to US war crimes in Iraq. While sponsoring the corrupt Ghani regime, the USA, behind the back of the Afghan people, conducted separate negotiations with the Taliban, which led to the signing of a deal for the withdrawal of forces from the country. Ultimately, the people of Afghanistan, who, as our American colleagues repeatedly told us they were there to protect, were abandoned to their fate. They were left face to face with ruin, poverty, terrorism, hunger, and other challenges. Mr. President, one of the most monstrous consequences of this military intervention is the large-scale humanitarian and economic crisis that has afflicted the country. According to the assessments of many experts, the current humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan could lead to a larger number of deaths than during 20 years of war. However, instead of acknowledging their own mistakes and supporting the reconstruction of the destroyed country and paying reparations, the United States and their allies plan to solve the Afghan problem in the usual way. They quite simply, using politically correct language, blocked Afghan national financial resources and disconnected the banking system from SWIFT, pushing poor Afghans to the brink and forcing many of them to sell their organs and their children to somehow make ends meet. Despite appeals from UN humanitarian agencies, human rights organizations, and Afghans themselves, the United States continue to illegally retain the foreign assets of the country under various pretexts of human rights violations and the need to pay for the September 11th terrorist attacks, which the Afghan people had nothing to do with. This irresponsible behavior by the Western coalition and their attitude to what's happening in Afghanistan are not surprising given the formal reporting before the Security Council of the former NATO military mission, the International Security Assistance Force, which was subsequently replaced by the Resolute Support Training Mission. Against this backdrop, it is hypocritical for Western colleagues to try to continue to conduct dialogue with the de facto authorities using the language of ultimatums and the sanctions mallet and threatening using all sorts of other forms of pressure, including limiting their ability to effectively resolve pressing issues of peace and stability with the involvement of those in the region. We also see attempts to manipulate humanitarian assistance and support, demanding that the new authorities of Afghanistan first remedy the domestic political situation and address challenges. Fiery statements about the importance of resolving the question of human rights as a precondition for everything else don't hold water. I'd like to ask you, distinguished colleagues, if because of the situation that you've created in your inaction, women and children are dying, is that not a human rights violation? Mr. President, we have repeatedly said that stability in Afghanistan is the key to peace and stability in the region and beyond. Russia has been consistent in its stance aimed at achieving a quick political settlement and national reconciliation in the country. We continue to believe that The Afghans themselves must resolve these questions. For us, what is extremely important is the reconstruction, development and prosperity of an independent Afghanistan that is free from the threats of terrorism and drugs. We prioritize in particular political inclusivity and the upholding of human rights, including of women and girls. Achieving all of these goals is the aim of our efforts bilaterally with the de facto authorities and other Afghans, and also within the Moscow format, meetings of regional neighbours, and also through regional organisations, the CSTO and the SCO. We also provide active humanitarian assistance to the fraternal people of Afghanistan. Mr. President, we are fully aware of the new reality that has taken hold in Afghanistan. We would like to underscore that we continue to believe there is a need to ensure constructive cooperation between the international community and the Taliban. We believe that it is just this sort of dialogue that will help achieve an effective solution to the tasks of political inclusivity, the fight against terrorism and drugs, and upholding human rights, including those of women and girls. However, we are not willing to accept the attempts of our Western colleagues to simply turn the page of history of Afghanistan and to blame everything on the Taliban and to start from a clean slate, as though the last 20 years hadn't happened. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Let me thank USG Griffiths, DSRSG Potzel, and Dr. Morgan Edwards for their briefings. And let me start by offering condolences to Pakistan following the devastating flooding in their country this week. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families. And as my Minister Lord Ahmed has said, we are working with the Pakistani authorities to establish the support and assistance they need. The United Kingdom stands with the people of Pakistan at this time of need. President, Russia has called for this meeting 1 year after the withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan. And as we reflect on that anniversary, we should also recall the legacy of the Soviet Union's 10-year occupation of Afghanistan from 1979 until 1989, that created the conditions for devastating civil war and the rise of the Taliban in the 1990s. Today, it is clear that the situation in Afghanistan remains critical and the needs of the Afghan people acute. As we have heard, over 24 million Afghans are in need of humanitarian support, and nearly 20 million are facing acute food insecurity. Economic stability and the delivery of basic services are essential to end the cycle of suffering in Afghanistan. There remains a vital need to inject liquidity into the country to avoid economic collapse. While UK personnel have left Afghanistan, our commitment to the Afghan people remains resolute. Between April 2022 and March 2023, the United Kingdom committed $676 million in aid to Afghanistan. Our Foreign Secretary co-hosted the UN Humanitarian Pledging Conference earlier this year, raising $2.4 billion. By contrast, Russia contributed nothing to the UN Humanitarian Response Plan. China pledged $2 million. On top of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, the human rights situation is stark. There are credible allegations of extrajudicial killings and detentions and disappearances, including civil society activists and former security forces and government officials. The last few months have also seen the imposition of deplorable restrictions on the rights and freedoms of women and girls, including on access to education, jobs and services, and on their freedom of movement and dress. It is clear to all but the Taliban that the full, equal and meaningful participation of women in society is a prerequisite for a stable, prosperous Afghanistan. The Taliban have also been repeating other mistakes from the past, not least the harbouring of the leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, in downtown Kabul in breach of their international commitments. We again call on the Taliban to meet its commitments, to ensure principled, unhindered humanitarian access across the country, to uphold basic human rights, most pressingly for women and girls, and to ensure Afghanistan is never again a permissive environment for terrorist groups. Strong and consistent UN leadership remains crucial to ensuring a well-coordinated and prioritised response, and UNAMA has our full support in delivering its mandate provided by this Council. President, 1 year ago, this Council adopted Security Council Resolution 2593, which set out our shared expectations of the Taliban. We hope the Council can continue to speak with one voice to press the Taliban on its commitments and to support the Afghan people in overcoming the challenges ahead. We thank the UN for their ongoing and tireless efforts. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom and now give the floor
to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the USG Griffiths and Mr. Podzel for their update and listened carefully to the account from Ms. Edwards. A year has passed since the return of the Taliban to power in Kabul, a long year that by all counts has been disastrously lost. The overall situation, as we heard, in the country is critical. It is going through one of the worst humanitarian crises, and what USG Griffiths presented needs no further comment. The economy is in free fall, and in 1 year the Taliban have managed to shrink it by 1/3. No surprise that human and drug trafficking are on the rise. Mr. President, as if the economic, the humanitarian, the man-made and natural catastrophes were not enough, Afghanistan continues to suffer from terrorism. The presence of the al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul confirms fears expressed repeatedly here on the persisting and pervasive ties between the Taliban and transnational terrorist groups. We call on the Taliban to denounce terrorism in all its forms and to cut ties with terrorist organizations. Mr. President, Afghanistan is today one of the worst places to be a woman. Contrary to their promises, the Taliban are undoing decades of progress in empowering women in the Afghan society. They have forced women into silence. They have deprived them from their legitimate role in society, and they've made them invisible from the public place. Young girls are forced out of school, the only country in the world to impose such shocking measures, and girls are forced into early marriages. Women are starving and have lost their access to their hard-earned rights, education and jobs. And with the Taliban, life in Afghanistan has lost its colors. Oppressing half of the population is the shortest path to perpetual misery and obscurantism. It most brutally tramples on the basic norms of rights and dignity. We should not accept such an aberration to continue, or worse, gain support. Afghan women and girls need our help more than ever. We call on the Taliban to change their course, take steps to lift restrictions on women and girls, respect their human rights, and meet the expectations of the Afghans and the world to permit their full, equal, and meaningful participation in work, education, and public life, as well as freedom of movement and freedom of speech. These are critical prerequisites for long-term peace, stability, and development of the country. Mr. President, the unfolding and worsening Afghan tragedy presents a daunting challenge even for a united and responsive international community. The de facto rule of the Taliban lacks legitimacy. They have given no indication to be capable of dealing with any of the existential challenges facing the Afghan people, except for letting them get worse or actively making them worse. Such disarray will only fuel resistance, create tensions, and lead to violence. We welcome any help and support to the Afghan people in these dark times, and we strongly support UNAMA's work and that of the NGOs present in the country under such challenging conditions. We stand with the Afghan people in their demand for equal rights in conformity with Afghanistan's obligation under international law and reiterate our call on the Taliban to respect them. It is a fact that Taliban are in charge. They must know that the decisions they have made so far are punishing Afghans, are isolating the Taliban further from the international community, and make them the only responsible for sending the country spiraling into abyss. They are and will be judged by what they do. It is not very difficult to understand, even for the inexperienced Taliban. You cannot pretend to move forward by walking backwards. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Undersecretary General Griffiths and Deputy Special Representative Ponzel, for your briefings. Mr. President, colleagues, I'm glad this meeting was called today, not for the reasons the Russians requested it, but because the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is grave, as we heard from UN briefers, and requires our attention. Flash floods, earthquakes, avalanche, droughts, and terrorism have made a desperate situation more dire. The global food insecurity crisis, exacerbated by COVID, climate, and conflict, has been felt acutely by the Afghan people. You heard the statistics Undersecretary Griffiths outlined describing what he calls the relentless layer of crisis. The Taliban have failed to provide for the Afghan people. In fact, they have done just the opposite. The Taliban's policies repress and starve the Afghan people instead of protecting them. The Taliban's exclusion of outside voices mean that the people who would contribute toward alleviating the suffering from these crises are not allowed to help. Among the Taliban's most egregious actions has been its repression and abuse of women and girls. The Taliban have denied women the opportunity to work, a decision that is both unjust and economically perilous. In Chicago last week, I met with an Afghan refugee who had found a new life in the United States. But he's kept up at night knowing his wife is still there. She was educated, engaged in the private sector, and contributing to her country. Now she's secluded in her home. Equally egregious is that girls have not been allowed to return to school. This is both a moral problem and an economic problem. UNICEF estimates the Afghan economy would gain $5.4 billion if the Taliban let girls go to secondary school and join the workforce. On top of that, the Taliban's proclamation that it would be best for women to simply stay at home if a male chaperone can't accompany them means that nearly all female-headed households in the country aren't getting enough food to eat. Instead of looking to the international community for help with these crises, the Taliban harbored the leader of al-Qaeda in downtown Kabul. How can they expect to build a relationship with the world when the Taliban provides safe haven to those who seek to do harm to us all? And I do mean all of us. And in recent months, the Taliban have even made the delivery of humanitarian assistance more difficult. They continue to interfere with the delivery of critical assistance that the Afghan people desperately need. The Taliban has increased taxes on critical assistance, and it fails to protect humanitarian aid workers. All of which to say, the Taliban are not providing for the Afghan people in their time of need. But the United States will not give up or look away. We're determined to help the Afghan people. We've worked to assist the Afghan people multilaterally through the UN and this council. Last year, we led this council's effort to unanimously adopt a resolution which established a carve-out for the delivery of humanitarian aid for the Afghan people. And we have strongly supported the work of the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. We supported extending its critical work this past March. Its good offices, outreach, and human rights reporting continue to be invaluable. And we have also worked bilaterally to help the Afghan people directly. The United States is the world's leading donor in Afghanistan. This last year alone, we have provided more than $775 million in humanitarian assistance directly to the Afghan people and Afghans in the region. And we're proud to be the largest funder of UN operations in Afghanistan. We've also issued 7 general licenses to enable economic activity for the Afghan people. And we are supporting efforts to protect, preserve, and facilitate access to approximately $3.5 billion in Afghan central bank assets for the benefit of the Afghan people. Let me be clear, no country that is serious about containing terrorism in Afghanistan would advocate to give the Taliban instantaneous, unconditional access to billions in assets that belong to the Afghan people. The countries that have rolled up their sleeves and tried to engage with this issue, like ours, have seen how the Afghan central bank was hollowed out long ago. It does not have a credible anti-money laundering system in place. It does not have a credible system for combating the financing of terrorism, and it does not have an independent monitor in place to verify improvements in capacity through technical assistance. So the Afghan central bank on its own cannot currently conduct responsible monetary policy. Fortunately, there is one reason the Afghan currency has held stable, because major donors, including the United States, have generously contributed well over $2 billion in humanitarian assistance and basic needs programming to the country since last August. Today, we've heard Russia say this is not sufficient. Russia argued, as others have in the past, that Afghanistan's problems are the fault of the West and not the Taliban. Really? Here's my question. What are you doing to help, other than rehash the past and criticize others? If you're concerned that Afghan women and children are dying, how are you helping them? Russia has contributed only $2 million to the UN Afghanistan Humanitarian Response Plan to date, and Russia has contributed nothing, not 1 cent, nothing this year. China's contribution have been similarly underwhelming. If you want to talk about how Afghanistan needs help, that's fine. But we humbly suggest you put your money where your mouth is. In the meantime, the United States, along with other partners and allies, including many on this council, will continue to diligently do everything we can to support the Afghan people. We will continue providing humanitarian assistance. We will continue supporting UNAMA. We will continue to be a champion for Afghanistan's women and girls. We will continue to do everything we can to help the mothers and daughters, the fathers and sons, the people of Afghanistan who deserve so much. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I give the floor to the representative.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.